Have you had an encounter with Mr. or Mrs. Tall, Dark, and Scary? Well, if so, send me an email with all the details. Don't leave anything out. You can send your email to me at contact@buckeyebigfoot.com. Hey there, everyone. Thanks for coming by tonight. Now listen, tonight we've got a couple of comments left on recent videos. We'll start with those first. And then I have an email that was meant for the Halloween marathon. She said I could hold it to Squatchmas if I wanted, but I don't know. I just thought I'd go ahead and slip this one in. So I'm going to share that tonight. So go on, get your snackage, and get your booty on up in the saddle. It's time we head out to Sasquatch Valley. Loved hearing this experience. How wild was that? Nance, I love how you tell these stories of experiences people have had. Love the artwork in these. When we were allowed to feed the wildlife where I live, I'd leave peanuts out on a stone stump for the late-night wanderers who came through in the night. I came to find out there was a young Sasquatch coming through and enjoying some peanuts. We aren't allowed to put out feed at all for birds or wildlife, so he doesn't come around anymore. Last I visited my sister's farm, they loved to get into the apples they stored in the barn for the horses. Finally had to bring them into the house instead to store them. They also would get into the dog food kibble and their rawhide treats. They also loved to play with the outside door to the tack room, where we always entered the barn when we were in there. They'd open it wide, then slam it shut so hard the barn would shake in the tack room. First time this happened to me, I ran real quick and looked around outside, and no one was in sight anywhere. They move quickly and silently when they want to. The horses were all out in the pasture, and I was fixing some fresh food for the dogs and then put out some fresh hay and alfalfa with fresh water in each stall for the horses. I told them, yeah, that was funny, and I laughed. They never did it again. They are tricksters. They do have fun. 2 encounters while with my German Shepherd, who stands 6 to 8 feet on hind legs. 10 to 12 feet in front of us, he was shocked, as we were, walking near my camper at 8:20 a.m., August 2023, near Fort Campbell, Tennessee. Dog went crazy, trying to attack, but the leash held him back, but he was jumping very high. I am very skilled in handgun from the hip, and drew my 13-shot 45 cal with my FBI defense loads. I told it I had a gun, didn't want to kill it, but would if he didn't stop killing my ranch animals. I had 17 cats killed the past 4 weeks. I showed him my 45 as I pointed it at his head, finger on the trigger. He tried to flank us, left, center, right, center. The whole time my German Shepherd was snapping at him. Then he stopped, honored the gun, and left. A few days later he returned to my front door. The head against a tree knot put him at 9 feet 2 inches. Hi, Nance. Every year I tell myself that I'm going to send you my encounter stories. There have been a lot. Only 2 where I have seen a Sasquatch, but we spent 7 years with them living on our property in North Carolina. Now we live in Guernsey County, Ohio, and they are also here. First of all, my husband grew up in Ohio. In fact, he grew up directly across the road from where we now live. When he was small, I'm not sure of the exact age, well, he was playing outside one evening, and his mother called him inside. He saw something huge behind the bush in the field behind their house. He didn't know what it was. When his mother asked him what he saw, he said he saw a dinosaur. In his little boy mind, that was the closest thing he could come up with that would be that big. Later on in life, after he had moved to North Carolina, and after we had been married for a number of years, he came back to his boyhood home to visit his family. He was staying in that same house, in the same bedroom that was always his. He was sleeping with his window open. He woke up, coughing. He sat up on the bed and saw something out of the corner of his eye. He looked out the window, and there he saw a Sasquatch, about 10 feet tall, and it walked right past his window. Funny thing is, it was walking across the road and up beside what is now our house. He told me about it the next day. Of course I believed him. I know my husband would not make something like that up. Not long after that, I went with him to Ohio to visit. He took me outside to show me the branch the Sasquatch hit his head on when he walked by. That branch was most definitely 10 feet off the ground. That thing must have been huge. In my mind, I'm thinking that the Sasquatch must have been watching him through the window until my husband sat up. Now, those are my husband's visual encounters. On to mine, and then on to our 7-year adventure. When I was very little, I remember playing outside in the snow when we lived outside of Addison, New York area. We were on a dirt road. I remember seeing giant human-shaped footprints with ice frozen over them. I remember thinking how neat that was and just breaking the ice out of them. I do not remember ever mentioning it to my parents. I remember that I just thought that it was neat and went about with my playing. I looked up on a hill behind the house. It was a good distance away. I saw something walk beside what I thought was one of those long, narrow chicken coops. The Sasquatch stopped and stared at me. I stared back. Then it walked off and I went back to playing again. I don't know why, but I remember thinking that it was so odd. All black, top to bottom, very large, very thick, much bigger than any man. I think even in my young mind that I knew that was not a man. Later in life I had asked my father about that place and about the chicken coop up on the hill. It was then that he informed me that there was no chicken coop there, that was a barn. And that tells me that this thing was much bigger than I realized. These events had enough of an impact on me that I have never forgotten them. I can see those footprints covered in ice and that thing on that hill as clearly today as I could then. I do remember that I did not have any fear of it. I guess I felt like it was a normal thing, interesting, but normal. Years later in my adult life, I moved to North Carolina, met my husband, and married him. At one point we bought a property that was secluded. It was surrounded by large evergreen trees, so we could not be seen from the main road, nor could any neighbors see us. It was absolutely beautiful. Not long after we moved in, things began to happen that were unexplainable. One night my grandkids were sitting on the couch watching a TV show. I opened my back door to let my cat inside. There was a scream that made every hair on my body stand up. I had never heard anything like it. Of course, my grandkids wanted to know what that was. I told them it was an owl or something, which I was certain it was not. However, I truly had no idea what it was. I just didn't want them to be afraid. My husband and I listened to Buckeye Bigfoot, Sasquatch Chronicles, and Dixie Cryptid. We began to see that things that were happening at our home all the time, well, they were typical Sasquatch behavior. The screams, breaking tree branches that were easily 10 foot plus high, and at least 6 inches or more in diameter. I mean fresh green wood, not dead. And then always pointing in the same direction. Rocks being thrown at our home, at us, at our dogs, and they even hit our house with their hands. I have pictures of the handprints and the tree breaks. They even threw rocks at our car and set the alarm off. They threw silverware that my grandkids had in their sandbox at my daughter when she was on our back porch one night. So many things that fit the behavior that we were learning about. Then the chatter. Samurai chatter is what most people call it. By this time, we knew exactly what was happening. One day, my husband and I took a walk into the wood line. He had mowed the area and cleared it up. He wanted to show it to me. While we were walking around inside the wood line, he was showing me the area that he had mowed and was telling me what his next plans were. There was a small creek running between our property and the neighbor's property. It was shrouded in trees and shrubs on both sides, so there was only one area where you could actually see the creek. Out of nowhere, we heard what sounded like a giant chimpanzee. It was there, just across the creek. We couldn't see it because of all the trees and shrubs, but that's where the sound came from. It was so close. We looked at each other and said, "What the heck was that?" Then we left promptly. We walked because we were both raised not to run from predators. I kept looking back, but I still couldn't see anything through the trees and shrubs. We knew what it was, but until that happened, I had no idea that Sasquatches even did that. This was in the daytime, a bright, sunny day. I was afraid to be outside at night. I didn't want my grandchildren going near the woods, even during the day. We learned that they do not like to come into the light. They avoid game cameras and security cameras. I'm a firm believer that they can see in the infrared spectrum. They can produce infrasound like tigers and other animals do. It only makes sense. So we put up a bunch of motion sensor lights and game cameras and security cameras. Getting one in a picture or on video, that would have been great, but we felt sure that would not happen. Our main goal was to keep them away from the house. It didn't stop them from throwing things or screaming, but they stopped hitting the house. After 7 years there, we decided to sell the property to our son and move to Ohio. We had the opportunity to buy the house across from where my husband grew up. My son believed us, but didn't think they were as big of a problem as we were making it out, until he moved in. They are the main reason that he ended up selling the place, but I'll get to that. When we bought this place in Ohio, we came up to do some work on the house for the insurance company before we moved in. On one particular day, my husband and brother-in-law pressure washed the house. Later in the day, probably around 5 or 6 p.m., my husband and I went outside to walk around the house to see how good it looked after the pressure washing. We'd walked through the backyard, and he was talking about more plans that he had. He's always got more plans. I felt like something was off. I turned and looked at the field behind our house, and there, in broad daylight, was a huge Sasquatch down on all fours. It was facing away from us as though it were in the process of walking up the hill when we came out. Apparently, it just decided to freeze and be still. I looked at it, thinking, that's hair. That's a lot of hair. There was long hair hanging down from what certainly looked like an arm. I didn't see a face, but I was trying to find it. I was just lost in thought. I wanted to take a picture of it, but I had left my phone in the house, which I rarely did. My husband came up beside me and asked if I saw something, and I told him I wasn't sure. Maybe it was just a big red bush. I was trying to convince myself that it couldn't be a Sasquatch. He glanced at it and he said, "Yep, that's just a bush." So then I just felt stupid for even thinking that way, and I walked off with him. The entire time, something just felt off. It didn't sit right with me. The next morning, we were leaving to go back to North Carolina. I had been up all night thinking about that bush/Sasquatch. So I walked out back to see. Sure enough, there was nothing there. Now, bushes don't just get up and walk off. Not ever. We were in a hurry to go, and he had been rushing me, so I just took a picture of the empty field to show him later. We left. Later in the morning, as we were heading down the interstate, I asked him if he remembered that giant bush in the backyard. He said yes. So then I told him that there was no bush there now. You should have seen the look on his face. I pulled out my phone and showed him the picture of the empty field. I honestly don't know why I let his words convince me that it was a bush and not a Sasquatch like I knew it was. I think maybe I just didn't want to believe it. I mean, we were moving away from Sasquatches on the property, right? Not moving to where there were more. Even knowing that he had seen one as a child and one in recent years, both across the road, before we bought this place, I guess I just didn't think about that when I agreed to buy this house. That one in the backyard, that was the same color as an orangutan. I can't explain to you just how big it was. One night after we moved in, the house was hit from outside somewhere. We immediately put up cameras the next day. We have had no issues since. My neighbor has had some dealings with yells and one juvenile, but nothing aggressive. But those are her stories to tell, not mine. I've told many people about our dealings with the Sasquatches over the years. Most people make jokes about it, even some in our own family. One person asked me if I thought they were following us to 2 different states. I told that person no. What I think is that after all we have been through, we know what to look for. Your average person, or should I say skeptic, they don't know. Until a skeptic has their own encounter, there is nothing that any of us knowers can say that will convince them. On the flip side, after what we have seen and dealt with, there is nothing that any skeptic can say to convince us that we're crazy. We are country folk, born and raised. These things are not bears. There is no way to mistake them for another animal. Now, you can possibly convince yourself that what you saw was something else for a little while, but it won't last. You can't deny what you have seen with your own eyes. Honestly, I really miss that property in North Carolina. I do not miss the constant Sasquatch issues, but I really do miss that property. My son did buy that property from us. He used to stand outside and try to do the whoops and call them. He was always walking in the woods to find them. He wasn't afraid because he was always armed. One day he went for a walk near the lake, across the road from the property, but it was an easy walk under a bridge so they could avoid the roadway. He heard something in the trees beside him. He turned around, and there were 2 of them, within just feet of him. I'm sure they knew exactly who he was. They were making some weird sounds and swaying side to side. Once he was able to move, because he naturally froze, he slowly walked back to his truck and got out of there. He called me immediately and told me that he found them. He told me that he put his hand on his gun, which was in the back of his shirt, but then decided that it would only make them angry. Up until he saw them face to face, he was not afraid. Once that happened, he said that he did not own a gun big enough to stop them. My son left that place because of the Sasquatches. They really did not like him at all. I think it's partly because he found them, and because he had a lot of guns and was always shooting outside. He had set up a shooting range, which he used regularly. The range was facing that place in the woodline where we heard the chimpanzee-like yell. They literally destroyed his hunting blind and destroyed all of his targets on the range that he set up. They were outside his window every night. They were chattering and hitting the house, throwing things at his truck. Needless to say, he could not wait to sell that place and leave, which he finally did. So this was a long email, I know, but I have wanted to get this information to you for a couple of years now. I thought it better just to put it all in one email. Let you decide if you want to use any of it. It's your decision, but maybe you won't use any of it. Either way, I'm going to continue listening to your channel because I love the encounter stories and I love your calm voice. Please don't use my name. I have enough people, including my family, that think we're all crazy, although they probably wouldn't be listening to this stuff anyway. You can just call me Nana T. Well, there you have it, my Sasquatch. I do hope you enjoyed those as much as I did. Again, we are beginning to take submissions for Squatchmas. I really probably should have saved this for Squatchmas, but I just really liked it and wanted to go ahead and use it. But if you have something you'd like to submit for Squatchmas, just send it to contact@buckeyebigfoot.com and let me know you want it held for Squatchmas. All right, everyone, I think that's going to do it for tonight. Until we meet up again, you know what I need you to do. Please, always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.